Good morning. I'm Naomi Kikoler, the Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. It is an honor to welcome you to the museum. As an institution that understands all too intimately the cost of indifference, we seek to put a spotlight on communities that are neglected and that are experiencing or at risk of mass atrocities. In doing so, we aim to do for communities today what was not done for the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. We're here today to talk about one of the most urgent crises of our time, a crisis that has persisted in one iteration or another for decades, the plight of civilians across Burma. The museum began working on Burma in 2013 when we highlighted our concerns regarding threats against the Rohingya community in the country and sounded the alarm about the risk of genocide. At a time when Burma was emerging from military dictatorship, the Rohingya, an ethnic and religious minority, remained at great risk. Rampant hate speech, impunity for past crimes, and discriminatory and violent efforts to push the Rohingya out of the country's political, social, and cultural life stood in stark contrast to the world's embrace of the country's initial transition to democracy. The US and other countries' default position was that by advancing democracy, there would be an inevitable improvement in the plight of the Rohingya and other persecuted communities. That assumption proved dangerously wrong. The Tatmadaw, Burma's military, attacked Rohingya civilians using their infamous brutality that had traumatized Rohingya and others in the past. The devastation of those attacks was harrowing and included mass killing, rape, torture, arson, and arbitrary arrest and detention. More than 700,000 people were forcibly displaced, swelling camps in Bangladesh, where Rohingya now face a precarious future. Our exhibition, Burma's Path to Genocide, shows, and as civil society leaders from across Burma will attest, the genocide of the Rohingya was predictable and preventable. The Tatmadaw had for decades earlier committed systematic and widespread attacks against civilians in many areas of the country. Survivors and others are fighting for justice, but in Burma, impunity has persisted. Over 2 years ago, the Tatmadaw, the same military that committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya, seized power from the country's elected leaders. Since then, the military has attacked civilians across the country, from health workers to children, to protesters to concert goers. Since the coup in February of 2021, the military has killed approximately 3,000 people, and over 1 million people have been displaced. UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in Myanmar, Tom Andrews, has characterized these attacks as crimes against humanity and war crimes. Ethnic and religious minority groups have been targeted since the coup and for decades before. The UN fact-finding mission stated in its 2018 final report, several years before the coup, that Burmese military leaders should be investigated and prosecuted for crimes against humanity and war crimes for its attacks against civilians in Kachin, Shan, and Rakhine State. The fact-finding mission report said that these crimes are shocking for the level of denial, normalcy, and impunity that is attached to them. The Tatmadaw's contempt for human life, integrity, and freedom, and for international law in general, should be a cause for concern for the entire population. While the crimes in Burma may no longer feature in international headlines, we are honored to hear today from experts who are doing all that they can to stem the Tatmadaw's attacks on civilians and protect their communities from future harm. We're joined here today by civil society leaders from various communities in Burma who've experienced mass atrocities and who have been tirelessly working to document these crimes and share this information with the world. We want to hear from this diverse group about what US-Burma policy has meant for their communities and what future steps could be taken to ensure safety and justice for civilians across Burma. It is now my honor to introduce recorded remarks from a close museum friend and a remarkable advocate for the Burmese people, Tom Andrews, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar.
Thank you, Andrea, Naomi, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for organizing this important and very timely event. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in Washington this morning. I'm currently in Indonesia as part of a four-nation trip to engage UN member states and a wide range of individuals and organizations about the escalating crisis in Myanmar, the deteriorating conditions for Rohingya refugees, and what the world can and must do about it. I am especially honored to share a platform with friends who continue to do the critically important but often unheralded work of advocacy with and for the people of Myanmar. I am certain that they will describe conditions within Myanmar, including the impact of the junta's increasing use of jet fighters and helicopter gunships to attack villages, schools, clinics, and IDP camps. It is clear to me that these and other barbarous actions by the Myanmar military amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. Meanwhile, the junta's incomprehensible obstruction of humanitarian aid following Cyclone Mocha has added to the already immense suffering in Western Myanmar. It is not at all surprising that many thousands have come to the conclusion that living under these conditions is no longer an option. But the fact is, crossing the Myanmar border does not mean an end to life-threatening challenges. Far from it. I am extremely worried for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh whose living conditions continue to deteriorate. Two recent rounds of cuts to their already meager food rations, for example, has meant that people in these camps who are not allowed to work must try to survive on 27 cents per day. This is not only causing hunger and malnutrition, 41% of Rohingya children have stunted growth, but a rise in tension and violence in the camps. The Rohingya who are in these camps are being left with a terrible choice. Brave hunger and violence in Bangladesh, return to Myanmar through a dangerous repatriation plan where you have no rights and are literally surrounded by a military whose genocidal attacks sent you over the Bangladesh border in the first place, or entrust your families to smugglers and make deadly journeys at sea. I believe that we are at an important and perilous moment, an inflection point in the crisis in Myanmar. And I believe that it is critical that the international community face the fact that what we are doing or not doing about this crisis is not working. We are failing the people of Myanmar. It is imperative that we change course. For this to be possible, Myanmar must no longer be invisible to the nations of the world, out of sight, out of mind. Human rights advocates must work strategically and in coordination to build the political will necessary for nations to act. Those whose advocacy is based in the United States have been making a difference. The U.S. is the leading provider of humanitarian aid to the people of Myanmar and to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. The advocacy efforts of many enabled the passage of the Burma Act in December, demonstrating that bipartisanship is possible in Canada. The implementation of that act is now critical, especially with regard to the provision of non-lethal assistance to opposition groups. But more work is needed, and it's needed right now. Nearly halfway through 2023, the Myanmar Humanitarian Response Plan is only 14% funded, and the Rohingya Joint Response Plan is only 22%. I have heard that some nations, the United States included, may in fact reduce their contributions even more. This is absolutely the worst time to be considering reductions of any kind. In my meetings with governments, I am urging that those who have already contributed consider what more they can give and what they can do to encourage others to follow suit. The leadership of the United States is absolutely necessary to stop the junta from continuing its assaults on the people of Myanmar by cutting off what sustains these assaults: money, weapons, and legitimacy. I have urged the Biden administration to consider convening a coalition of those nations who are willing to stand with and for the people of Myanmar for the purpose of elevating the visibility of the steepening crisis and establishing coordinated strategic action. Actions by UN member states in support of human rights in Myanmar lack strategic coordination. They do not add up. And many of these actions, such as sanctions, are not being enforced. Unenforced sanctions are not sanctions. This must change. As I noted in my recent report, the billion-dollar death trade, money, weapons, and weapons materials continue to flow to the junta that has led to the living nightmare that is the reality for untold numbers of people throughout Myanmar. The crisis in Myanmar is at an inflection point. time for robust, coordinated action is now. And to make that possible, we need you and your advocacy. Many thanks again to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for organizing this forum and for asking me to participate. I look forward to working with all of you to support the people of Myanmar in their courageous struggle to save their nation and their children's future. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Special Rapporteur Andrews for expressing the urgency of the situation, and thank you to Naomi for the kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for joining us here today. As Special Rapporteur Andrews just said, the crisis in Burma is at a key moment. There has been some momentum since the February 2021 coup in terms of how the U.S. is responding to ongoing risks facing civilians. Secretary Blinken shared the U.S. determination that the Burmese military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya. The U.S. has sanctioned scores of individuals and businesses, including this morning, granted temporary protected status to Burmese nationals in the U.S., and as Special Rapporteur Andrews mentioned, is the largest donor to the humanitarian response in Burma and Bangladesh. But more is needed to prevent mass atrocities against civilians in Burma and to address the long history of mass atrocities by its military. It is my honor to introduce our expert panelists for today's discussion, who will share their insights on what might be needed now. I am joined today by Myra Daigapal, who's a Karen human rights activist and Senior Partnership Officer for International Justice and Accountability at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. Myra was an internally displaced person and a refugee before resettling in the United States, and she has long been a community organizer. Weiwei Nu, the founder and executive director of the Women's Peace Network, an organization that advocates for the rights of marginalized women in Burma, especially in Rakhine State, seeks to build peace and mutual understanding between Burma's ethnic communities. A former political prisoner, she has dedicated her work to advancing democracy, human rights, and peace in her country. Gumsung Sang serves as a president of Kachin Alliance, a diaspora Kachin community-funded humanitarian and advocacy group. For over 15 years, he has been advocating for the rights of Kachin people, and since the military coup of 2021, he has served as secretary of the Kachin Political Interim Coordination Team, which worked with parliament representatives following the coup and paved the way for the creation of the National Unity Government. Rosalind Zahau is a human rights advocate and currently serves as an advocacy team member of the Chin Human Rights Organization. The Chin Human Rights Organization protects the rights of Chin people and other oppressed and marginalized communities in Burma through research, documentation, education, and advocacy. And thank you all for joining us today. I have some questions, and then we'll go to some questions that were submitted by registrants. My first question is for Weiwei. So we are gathered here over a year after the U.S. government made its determination that the Burmese military committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya. What did that determination mean for Rohingya civilians, and what has changed in terms of U.S. policy toward the Rohingya since then?
Thank you, Andrea. The U.S. government's genocide determination last year meant so much for all of us who are fighting for genuine justice, accountability, and peace in Burma. For the ethnic Rohingya, my community, the determinations provided with hope for justice and eventually being able to return to Burma voluntarily, safely, and with dignity, and subsequently restored our equal rights in Burma. Here, I would like to thank you, Andrea, Naomi, and everyone at the Holocaust Memorial Museum for sharing your work for Never Again with us. The Burma's Path to Genocide exhibition was fundamental to spreading awareness of the Rohingya genocide to wider U.S. community. So it is important for the U.S. government to follow its determinations with equally momentous actions. Since last year, apart from donating $1 million to IIMM, International Investigative Mechanisms on Myanmar, there hasn't been many substantial response or actions following the genocide determinations. So I think first, the U.S. government must at least implement the Burma Act of NDAA to provide comprehensive assistance to the victims and survivors of the Burmese military's atrocities. And it must also ensure that these assistance will be directed to Rohingya genocides victims and survivors. And this could also be done through a comprehensive legislations specifically on responding to the genocide. Second, the US must ensure protections for the Rohingya in Myanmar, as well as refugees in Bangladesh and other countries in South and Southeast Asia. US must not lose its leaderships on human rights and democracy by relying on ASEAN, China, and other countries in the region. The US must pressure these countries to implement pro-refugees policies and achieve Rohingyas' voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable repatriation. Third, the US government must bring justice and accountability to Burma. The US must at least redesignate Burma as a country of particular concern, continue to support the investigative mechanisms and related justice effort, and refer the situations of Myanmar to the International Criminal Court, and explore universal jurisdictions, and support a special or ad hoc tribunal on Burma so that we can holistically prosecute the crimes, international crimes committed by the Burmese military. The US should also issue more economic and financial sanctions, especially against the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. In this context, I'm pleased to hear that US government has implemented 2 new sanctions against the military banks, but more needs to be done for all these sanctions to be truly weaken the military. So basically a more comprehensive and coordinated sanctions. Therefore, 1 year since the US genocide determinations, the US must translate its policy on Burma to concrete and comprehensive sanctions, if I may reiterate, or else the Burmese military will be emboldened to commit more atrocities, including genocidal attacks in the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Weiwei. And you mentioned so many different things that different parts of the U.S. government can do. And just to clarify, you mentioned the Burma Act as part of the NDAA. So that's, of course, the Burma Act, a bill that was part of the legislation was passed as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which, as you mentioned, would allow some support for civil society and for some other groups who are part of the resistance against the military. And you mentioned the exhibition Burma's Path to Genocide, which I suggest that visitors visit afterwards. But we need to remember that there are many communities within Burma who have experienced mass atrocities for decades. I'd like to turn to Myra because people often talk about the civil war in Karen State as being one of the world's longest running civil wars. And so I'd like to ask you, what are civilians facing in Karen State and in other parts of southeastern Burma? What are people facing in terms of the fighting, the attacks, and what are they facing in terms of their humanitarian needs?
Thank you, Andrea. And certainly thank you to the museum. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first event, right, where we have 4 different ethnic groups sitting together talking about Burma issues. Amazing. Well, southeastern Burma. So if you look at the map here, you're going to see the orange and then going down to the pink lines. So that's where the area where, I mean, the Karen State, we talk a lot about Karen State. We hear a lot about Karen State, but Mon State, Tawai region, we don't really hear so much about the situation down there, but it doesn't mean that they are okay. I mean, they've been persecuted. The military carry out human rights abuses on a daily basis. So if we look back from February 1st, 2021, from the day the last military coup took place, fighting has been going on across the country. But one thing I'm not really sure if many of us pay attention is that the conflict is not between 2 groups, which are the military sect and the ethnic resistance organizations. On top of that, the military use the civilians to a certain extent, almost like the bargaining tool, because they think that, okay, if we're using women, if we're using civilians as human shield, or somebody in between, then maybe the ethnic armed organizations are not going to fight back. But I don't really think the answer is that easy. And when we come down to humanitarian access, please do not forget about the four-cut policy, the cutting of the funds, cutting of food, cutting of intelligence and recruits. Because all these are the factors that keep the organizations, the armed organizations, the ethnic groups, everyone alive. I mean, if we don't have these basic needs, we're not going to be survived, right? But then the military also taking, again, using the civilians as a tool and trying to disconnect us with our root or our government, our leaders. So basically, we have problem with travel restrictions these days. Our community, CBO, CSO, trying to provide humanitarian assistance, but then they cannot really bring over food in a bigger portion. They cannot carry like 100 bags of rice crossing Krini border to the IDP side. And then if you are asking why, then the military is thinking that, yes, the Korean civilians are taking this rice to go and send it over to the Korean army. That's not really the case, apparently. And we also have the burning down of the houses, the villages, all this stuff still going on across the country. Partly, they're trying to wipe us out because they think that we're housing the ethnic armed organizations, the PDF fighters, the freedom fighters, which is not really the case again. It's our home. We wanted to come back, but we cannot come back. Yes, if we go down the list, they arrest villagers, they use them as the porters. But I mean, with all these atrocities going on, we cannot really list it. It's going to be a whole long list. And if we look at just this year, in the past 4 months, according to the Institute of Strategy and Policy, the widespread violence unfolded across Burma, and at least 1,407 clashes erupted in 115 townships, while 442 airstrikes ravaged not fewer than 56 townships, claiming the lives of 693 civilians. 4 months, quite a number. And today, if we're looking at the southeastern Burma, going from Karen State down south, Mon State, as well as the Tavoy region, human rights situation is drastically deteriorated. I mean, I couldn't emphasize more from worst to worst. And the civilians describe the life that they are living now is the state of fear. Fear of not knowing when and where they will be attacked, they will be targeted. And so to date, that southern area alone, we have about 4,000 civilians who were arrested and detained, while about 1,000 injured and over 300 were killed. And the fighting that goes on has been going on in the past 2 years in the southeastern Burma. We have about new 550,000 internally displaced people, which 500,000, the number is from the Karen State alone. And another thing is that we have to bear in mind when we count these numbers, a lot of times the number is higher than the actual number that we are talking about. And so I couldn't stress more. The situation on the ground is really deteriorating, and we do need urgent, tangible action. Not just actions, but tangible action. Like what we said earlier, sanctioning Myanmar oil and gas is going to take out some piece of the military's, one of the military's biggest revenue. I mean, think about if only their income is cut off to a certain extent, then they will sort of like having a little trouble in terms of maybe purchasing new drones or sophisticated war weapons and all this stuff. Because right now they're using drones to surveillance where the internally displaced people are hiding, the locations. And then they come and they bomb the hiding place at night when people are sleeping. And so it leaves the civilians with no time or place to prepare to flee. And this is where we are right now. And so I do want to emphasize very strongly that sanctioning jet fuel is a must. The jet fuel, the countries, the organization, the allies of the military that sells the jet fuel to the Burmese military. But at the same time, sanctioning the companies that are shipping the jet fuel, because if only they can ship the jet fuel, then the fuel will get to the military. So if these shipping companies are sanctioned, then nobody will carry the jet fuel, and maybe we can, the airstrike will be decreased, and then the amount of brutality killing also will be decreased to a certain extent. But I wanted to emphasize, it is not going to be done overnight, but at least the level of brutality will decrease to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. And I think you've explained some ways that you can just kind of whittle away at the capacity of the regime that really has unleashed such brutality for many years, but especially over the past 2. I'd like to turn to Gumsan because Kachin State has experienced intense armed conflict since 2011. What are Kachin civilians facing today, and how has their experience changed over those last 12 years of conflict?
I would say it's more of a double whammy. So past 12 years, precursor to the coup, we've witnessed all the crimes that we've witnessed right now for past 10 years. Burning of homes, airstrikes, 500-pound bombs dropping. Those were always frequent in Kachin region. Displacement, 150,000 been displaced over past 10 years. Many of our children don't have any proper education in those past 10 years. Vulnerable population being trafficked into China. That's a very frequent event as well. And mass exploitation of natural resources. And land grabs to the scales that's unimaginable. If you look at eastern part of Kachin State, you'll witness a lot of banana plantations. Those are exported to China. Similar kind of arrangement that we would see in other Southeast Asian countries, but in a very massive scale. So that's just before the coup, I'm talking. And coup just maximized that kind of atrocities. And so during so-called the Great Transition, we were more or less viewed as an outlier because we were not part of the whole scheme of this transition. We were resisting against the military. And I guess this coup has only validated our suffering, that our claims are not untrue, they are true, they're facts. We did get bombed, those are facts. And I think we said, conflict in Kachin and genocide against Rohingya, lack of serious response by international community emboldened the military to stage a coup. And that's fact too. So I think when the coup came, the Kachin public were definitely not in concert even with the NLD government, but the moral imperative drove us to support for people's resistance. It wasn't just the leadership that wants to receive the member of parliament who actually enacted bills that were against our will or that were hurtful to us. Later becomes sheltered in our own homes. And that's the crux of this resistance movement. And a member of CDMers from medical communities, education community, they all took shelter in the resistance controlled area. We see this to be important because our Burmese politics in the past has been very transactional and retaliatory in some sense, even in community level or in ethnic levels. But I believe this conflict or this coup has transcended the people beyond that. And obviously the help of, advent of social media facilitated in this greater understanding of people. We've never seen this level of support or understanding of even genocide against the Rohingya community. But suffering has to come in a way to make that understanding. It's sad, but sometimes I use this period to be the crucible of hope, because there's a silver lining to this challenge. For that reason, when we started off with the KPIC Kachin Political Interaccommodation Team, which is the collaboration of five CSOs organizations, Kachin CSOs, and also with the KIO, we first reach out with the CRPH to start a UCC process and pave way for the NUG. And so 4 of our members now serve in the NUG cabinet, including the acting president, Duwale Sheila. So it's sometimes categorically people say, and it's an NUG is an NLD proxy, but I beg to differ, and it's not a monolithic organization, and I think it's important that international community supports it. And beyond that, it's just not the participation in the NUG, but rather vast, expensive way of participating in the resistant efforts, be it lethal, non-lethal support to people in Sagaing, Magway, Karenni, and also with the defector, we have actually created 2 PEZ, so-called PEZ, which is a People Embrace Zone for the defector from the military. That definitely needs humongous support, because we have very, very limited, even at the best of days, had less than 5% international communities assistance to our own IDP population. It's the church that actually mobilized to help for most of the shelter and food for these even besieged communities. But we think that more than 60 years of sufferings could be resolved if we put in additional work and investment at this time for the future. So that's for those reasons. Adaptability is something that we learn, and resilience is another factor that we learn, that we're able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can still launch the resistant movement and still have put up, universities in Maijayang and make it a college town where our kids still have access to credible education and build a healthcare system and also a financial. Now I think there's NUG's the blockchain financial money transferring system as well. So we're facilitating with those efforts as well. So 12 years of fighting alone has taught us a lot of lessons. And I think this also revolution, this spring revolution also enable us to have a much depth in the way that we multi-level resistance against this military regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Gumsan. And you've spoken about coming together and about the resilience of the Kachin community. And while that is a silver lining, it's also so tragic and it should not have been necessary that the community had to experience that much. I'd like to turn to Rosalind. Since the coup 2 years ago, Chin State and areas near Chin State have become an active armed conflict zone. What information has the Chin Human Rights Organization been collecting regarding large-scale attacks on civilians? And could you describe the civilians, the situation that they might have been facing in Chin State before the coup and what life is like now?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the museum for having 4 ethnic groups representatives to share about our challenges, the progress that we've made since the coup, and what can the government do to help us out to get out of this tragedy, so to say. So thank you so much. And we've also talked about having women panelists, and it's such a happy thing to have 4 women on the stage, not to discredit Gumsan, of course. So thank you for that. And as you can see, Chin State is at the western part of the country, bordering India and Bangladesh. And if I may focus on the pre-coup situation and post-coup situation, it might provide more clarity, I think. So before coup, as you rightly mentioned, we do not have a full-blown conflict, luckily, I would say, in Chin State. But despite that, we have many challenges. For example, I will highlight 5 to 6 points. Number 1 is we were under 2008 Constitution. As you all probably know, that is the constitution designed by the military to maintain their power. Even though we enjoyed 10 years of quasi-civilian government from 2010 to 2021 before the coup, it was never democracy. Everything was controlled by the military. Be it judiciary, be it ministries, important ministries such as border affairs were controlled by the military. Ministry of Home Affairs was under them, so it was never free in that sense. And structurally, they've tried to put Buddhism as a special religion by mentioning it explicitly in the constitution itself. By that, they've been, state-sponsored discrimination practices have been acted out against minorities, be it ethnic minorities, religious minorities. That's the first one. And luckily, Gumsan also talked about silver lining. In this coup, the people's government has abrogated 2008 Constitution. So moving forward, we all are hoping that the Constitution that all the people from Burma truly wants will be able to, will be enacted. So that's one of the silver linings. And moving on to the second problems that we faced before coup, freedom of religion has always been an important issue for many of us, including the Chin people. Chin State is 90% Christian-dominated state, one of the very few states from Burma dominated by Christians. And the military has been, as I've mentioned, in the 2008 Constitution itself, Buddhism is given a special place. And by that, they have also created the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And under that, one of their policies is to promote Buddhism any way they can. And if I may pick out one example, we call it Natala School. We call it assimilation program. They pick up poor children from Chin State. And one fun fact or one sad fact, Chin State is the poorest state in the whole country, even before the coup. So they pick out a lot of poor children from many townships of Chin State. They put them into these Natala schools. They provide free lodging, free food, free education. But through that programs, they force them to convert into Buddhism, and they do not allow them to speak in their native languages. So assimilation problem. We've seen that kind of problems in Canada or in Australia as well. And we have put out many reports on this Natala programs, Natala schools. So if anyone is interested, please feel free to look up online on our website, CHRO website. And the third problem is, oh, if I may add more problems, please stop me if I'm running out of time. They've also asked a lot of religious minorities to apply for permission, even to worship, let alone apply for building religious institutions or infrastructure. And they've also destroyed many crosses, which is very important for Christians symbolically. They've done those things. And through that also, land rights. We are one of the indigenous groups from Burma, and land are very important to any indigenous group, as you can probably imagine. But using this Ministry of Religious Affairs, they've taken a lot of land that previously belonged to religious institutions and force us to apply for permission from them in turning away our possession into their hands and asking us to apply for permissions to use those lands that belong to us. So those are some of the practices that they've used. And I've talked about poverty. That's also one of the key issues that we had to address even before the coup. Gumsan also talked about education. We've never had any higher institutions in Chin State. We've always been discriminated in that sense by the central government, the military-controlled government for decades. It was only after 2015 that we can have a higher education institution in Chin State. So those are some of the tactics that they've used. And although we did not have a full-blown conflict, in the southern part of Chin State, more than 40,000 people were displaced even before the coup, after the Chin National Front signed a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement with the military government at the time. So those are some of the problems we have. And now let me turn to post-coup situation. Chin State was one of the first states to take up arms to protest or to resist the 2021 coup. So because of that, the military has, stated officially, one of their official spokespersons stated in June 2021 that they will crush all the resistance forces from Chin State within 1 week. And they've really sent a lot of reinforcement troops into Chin State after the coup, after we took up arms to resist. And conflict has intensified since then. This is a picture of their, reinforcement troops coming to Chin State. And we did not have arms before the coup. A lot of people were just farmers, just working on their livelihood, But since then, they took up arms. We, for the Chins, we call it Dumi. It's like handmade guns. So they've used handmade guns to resist. And despite these challenges in weaponry, we've been able to control most part of Chin State as I'm speaking today. We have 9 townships in Chin State. Except for the towns, all the rest of the Chin State are under resistance forces. So we've done what we can with all the limitations. If only we can have more support from the international community, I'm sure we can win the military. And we have had like more than 150 airstrikes from the military because they are losing on the ground. So they are resorting to airstrikes. Dr. Mimi is here. She talked about the cost of airstrikes. They are very costly, and it wouldn't make sense for the military to use airstrikes if they can win on the ground, right? Because of the cost of airstrikes. But since they are losing on the ground, they resort to a higher cost of tactic, which is using the airstrikes. And we do not have the weaponry, the system to protect ourselves from all these airstrikes. So that's also an area that the US government can really help out. It would really mean a lot. It could save thousands of lives, millions of lives across the nation. And Myra has also talked about displacement. Gumsan has also talked about displacement. Chin State, likewise, we've also had 25% of the population displaced to neighboring countries, including India. And since this picture pops up, just let me give a brief context to the picture. This is a town from Chin State we called Kantlang town. This is one of the first towns, one of the first few towns that the military attacked after the coup. Because, as I've said, Chin State took up arms and they really wanted to crush all the resistance movements. So they burnt down the whole town. It used to be a lively, hilly town with beautiful churches, but it's a deserted town today. No one can stay in the town after the coup. So I might be jumping here and there, but to link that to the military command structure. Can we please go back to the map, the Burmese map? Yeah. So Chin State is also close to Sagaing and Magwe. As you can see, Sagaing is the purplish one, and Magwe would be the teal-colored one. So we are neighboring states. They are our neighboring states, and all of us are under the command of Northwestern Command in the military system, and they have been notorious in attacking the northwestern part as well, like they've been attacking the rest of the countries. And they've also deployed many battalions that they employed during the Rohingya genocide. So as of now, there are 12 battalions based in Chin State. Chin State is a small state with 500,000 population. So the deployment and the population of the civilian is, I mean, you can use your imagination to calculate the ratio. It's that intense right now. But aside from all these challenges, there are also silver linings, as my co-panelists have stated. We are more united than ever. Before the coup, whenever we talked about the sufferings of ethnic people, the kind of discriminations that we've been suffering, even from within the country, people can hardly understand us. They tend to think that we are being dramatic, we are exaggerating our problems, because the kind of treatment we receive are quite different from each other. But this time, everyone gets to see for themselves how ruthless and brutal the military can be. So since it has given us a common goal, we are more united than ever. And we've also been talking about federalism for decades. People have taken a lot of time to understand what that means and what really that means to a lot of ethnic groups. But I think this coup has given us the basic or the foundation to really deal with the question on federalism as well. So I think those are some silver linings. I'm happy to talk more about what can the government do to help us out more, but thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. And I'd like to turn to the question soon, but just noting CHRO has also been doing, Chin Human Rights Organization has been documenting a lot of these airstrikes, and you've been publishing that as well. But the level, the sheer number of airstrikes and the number of people impacted that you've been documenting is really shocking. So first, I'd like to turn to Weiwei before asking more general questions, because Weiwei, we don't often hear about Rohingya communities within Rakhine State. What are Rohingya within Burma facing today, and how has that situation changed since the height of the genocide 6 years ago?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to actually acknowledge and agree that the past 10 years of quasi-civilian rules or quasi-democracy wasn't actually democracy for many ethnic communities, including Rohingya, Kachin, Karen, and others. And many of the repressions and religious persecutions that was described by Rosalind has been shared among many ethnic communities. That was the state policies against all the ethnic and specifically ethnic and religious minority. If they're non-Burma or non-Buddhist, and they face harsher forms of policies and repressions, and that was shared. On top of that, Rohingyas suffered the most, and even before the coup, they were living in under circumstances like apartheid in Rakhine State, and it has gone. It has become severe after 2016 and 2017 clearance operations. Now, about 600,000 Rohingya remaining in Rakhine State, again, continuously living under apartheid-like conditions and facing further risks of genocidal attacks by the Burmese military. Since the attempted coup, 2021, we still call it attempted coup because we don't believe that military is one legitimate to has control over the country. So we still call it as an attempted coup. The military has actually issued many more laws and policies restricting Rohingya. And these targeted measures include restrictions on Rohingyas' movement in Rakhine State and across Burma, and required them discriminatory national verification card, as well as abusive family check-in measures. Many of these restrictions actually sound familiar. This is because they have been issued before the attempted coup, before the 2017 genocide. And like the past, the military is issuing such tools of genocide as a sham ground to arbitrarily arrest and detain Rohingya. At the same time, the military is systematically restricting Rohingyas' access to food, water, and basic services and livelihood. As a result of the military's targeted policies, Rohingya in Rakhine State have already lived in complete destitutions for decades, and even before the 2017 genocide. And they have been denied of their land, properties, educations, and employment, and any other basic human needs. Many of them have already been denied access to humanitarian aids provided by the UN and other international organizations. There are so many villages in central Rakhine State where there is no international assistance are available and people are barely surviving. There are some limited access to humanitarian assistance are available in Sidwe and in Budiyong and Mongdo. But most places where Rohingya are minority in different cities, there is no international assistance are right now available. But now with the militaries escalating their persecutions of Rohingya by actually completely denying the humanitarian provisions of the humanitarian aid to Rakhine State following the cyclone Mocha. Which overwhelmingly actually affected in Rakhine State. The cyclone Mocha killed a disproportionate number of Rohingya in the area. Reports confirm that the number of dead may be nearly or around 400. And many of them were IDPs who were confined in the IDPs, internally displaced person camp, where they cannot kind of seek for protections or safe houses or shelters by their own. Many of these casualties or deaths are women and children. So it is clear that absolutely nothing has improved since the genocidal attack 6 years ago, and the exacerbating situations has now left Rohingya with no choice but to risk human trafficking and deadly sea crossing. I fear that unless the international community acts now, Burma will see further genocidal attacks against the Rohingya.
Right. Thank you, Wei Wei. I mean, a lot of the structures that allowed genocide to happen 6 years ago are still there. And so we often talk about a risk of genocide, a heightened risk for people there and for people who might be returning. I'd like to ask a general question for anyone who would like to answer about what kinds of practical support the U.S. government can provide to protect civilians experiencing mass atrocities in your community. You've each touched on that a little bit, but I'd open it up to any panelist who would like to add.
I guess I can go first. I think this is a really a window of opportunity for the U.S. government or any government to really strengthen the capacity of their communities in Burma, including the Rohingya and including Chin, Kachin, Karenni, and even Burmese populations in Sagaing and Magwe divisions, where military lose their control and people have more power to exercise their own authorities and to exercise their own governance. And this is where I think the U.S. government and any international communities or government should exercise their uses this as a window of opportunity to really support them directly through the local governance or NUG or civil society, whatever is available. To be able to provide support to their communities directly is essential so that we become more sustainable or we become more self-reliant, and the capacity that we will be able to build will sustain with us, and that will prepare us for the future of the country in future federal democracy. So I think, you know, any direct support to the civil society, to any groups available, including governments, is essential. And second, there is a huge missing area of providing protection, direct protection to the people who are being, for example, arrested, detained, or facing like a severe risk of life threats. Providing legal aid or the relocation support or protection support, anything available will be great. That was available a little bit in the past at the beginning of the coup. That somehow decreased lately, and I think which is something very, very critical. For the case of Rohingya, there has been over 3,000 Rohingya women and men being detained since the attempted coup. There is no legal support available for them. So I think finding an innovative way to provide to provide support to the most pressing issues and vulnerable communities will be greatly effective. I guess I'll stop here and I'll come up if we have time more.
Anyone else? Welcome to start.
Okay, maybe we can go serial-wise. To echo and to add on to Wei Wei's point, I think I would come up with 3 specific points. The first one is in relation to the Burma Act, which Andrea has also talked about. Today also marks 180 since the U.S. Congress had passed the Burma Act. Symbolically, it has given us a lot of strength, because for the first time ever in the U.S. foreign policy, they mentioned ethnic resistance organizations as the groups that will receive support from the U.S. government. In the past, ethnic resistance organizations or ethnic organizations have never been officially mentioned or ever acknowledged. So in that sense, the Burma Act has really given a lot of energy to a lot of ethnic groups. And secondly, it also talks about non-lethal assistance, which can be a bit vague, but vague can be good sometimes, especially when it comes to legislation. It can give us more room to be more creative. So on that regard, non-lethal assistance, I may not be the best person to address that. I'm sure Gumsan will have a lot more to say on this, but to start it off, I think early warning system equipments could be very helpful. Communication devices, for example, Myra also talked about the 4-cut policy. For decades, the military has been using the 4-cut policy, which means food, fun, information, and recruits. Recruits, obviously, they cannot do that because they are losing a lot of their own people through defection. But food and funds, they can deny that to us. Through airstrikes, they create a lot of problems for us and in turn block humanitarian assistance. So that means they are successful already with those two policies. The third one, information, they've been cutting down a lot of internet, lines, phone lines in Burma. So we need more devices from the US government. Those are non-lethal assistance, so I think more support on that. And we've been waiting for 6 months with no updates on implementing the Burma Act. So the time cannot wait. Sometimes things can take a long time, but we are in revolution. We are in a revolution. People are dying daily. We are being attacked on a daily basis wherever we may be, as long as we are in Burma. So I think the US government's swift implementation would be great. The US Congress would pass appropriations, but it also depends a lot on the executive branch to really figure out how they would implement that. So on that regard, just to add on to the devices, jamming devices would be great as well. Airstrikes are relentless these days, wherever we may be. So I think jamming devices to, protect airstrikes would be great as well. And on the humanitarian side, USAID can be notorious for their compliance mechanism. They have a very high standard of compliance. And as you can imagine, we are in the middle of a revolution. A lot of organizations have to run to neighboring countries to continue with their operations. They may not have, official registration as of this moment. They may not have bank accounts, easy access to bank accounts. So I think, employing intermediate agency who could deal with those administrative steps would be very helpful. They've done that. The US government has done that in the case of Ukraine. So they can do it again for Burma as well. So I think it would be very helpful for everyone in the room as well to do your part to help us out on that front. And the rest, I will leave it to my co-panelists to add on. And
Okay. Yeah, all the points which I definitely agree. Sometimes we're viewing this conflict as people are revolting against this military regime alone, right? But we have to bear in mind that they are fully supported. It's just not a regime from Naypyidaw. We have to keep in mind that they are, morally supported, diplomatically supported, in terms of lethal, non-lethal, every conceivable way of support they do get from, from nations that has the second and third, rank, like on the global firepower index. We have to keep in mind. Without them, this military would have been over many, many months ago. This is strictly because of Russia and China supporting this regime. I say this because when we look at the conflict, even with the Kachin in the past 10 years, a lot of the bombings, like that 500 kilo bombs or like large bombs, some of them were even duds, right? They didn't detonate properly in the past. But if you look at what happened in Anangpa, this has happened in October 23rd, 2022. This is like at near midnight. It's really dark, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock p.m. concert. It blew up like right at the dead center of the event. We're talking about where the singer was singing, dead center, right? The precision level that is, and the lethality that they can utilize at this time is unprecedented. That they're able to navigate at night with these flights, which they weren't able to do in not even past 10 years, let's say even past 4 years ago. But now they are able to pull these off. Basiji massacre, hundreds of people slaughtered because they are able to get these geolocations off of social media feeds. And these technologies aren't just coming in from nowhere. They're coming in from other state actors that are able to facilitate them. So if we are resisting against such kind of global powers, what do you expect? I mean, it's obviously I had an opportunity. I had a jet lag, so I was walking around World War II Memorial. We would have wished that we would have halted, Hitler's army by moral support alone, right? But that's just not reasonable. And so is this crisis as well. Because this is just beyond Burma border that we're fighting. And that is principally the reason why we ask for airstrikes, right? And then MOC sanction challenge. And we ask for aviation fuel challenge, communication challenge. So the question comes back, like, what is capable for the global? We know the autocrats are aligning together to ensure their power, sustenance of their power. So the question comes for the world democracies. What are they expecting to contribute to ensure that global democracy sustains across the globe? So on that, I think your Starlink kind of is early warning system is essential. Without these airstrikes, I think our Kachin region would have been in complete and resistance control, because there's no more, all roadways are intercepted by resistance forces. We have control over all the roadways. There's not a single train that goes from Mandalay to the north anymore. There's no train tracks. Some of those tracks have turned into musket guns already. So that's the reality. But in order to expedite that, somebody has to help with this airstrikes. Thank you.
Do you mind if I go? I'll try to be quick. So, to protect the people of Burma, I just wanted to emphasize what Tom said earlier. Cut off the funds, cut off the weapons, and cut off the legitimacy. Because if they don't have funds, we know they're not going to be able to purchase a whole lot more. And perhaps that's when the level of the brutality will sort of like go down a little bit. And if they don't have the weapons, then of course they're going to be a little more careful in terms of bombing, right? And then of course, if the international community stop legitimizing the Burmese military and making sure that Burma is run by the civilian government, where we have the military under the civilian government, then I'd say perhaps to a certain extent, the country will be at a better place. And of course, to prevent all these atrocities to continue happening, or at least to reduce the atrocities to continue happening to a certain extent, justice and accountability is a must. There is no excuse. I mean, we have Rohingya genocide determination. It gets nowhere because there is no implementation, there is no tangible action. And so we all know the Burmese military is already immune to the resolutions, the condemnations and all this stuff. It is time for action. But what do we need? The political will, the will of the decision makers, the policy makers. And if any of you listening to us right now, or you may be watching later, I really wanted to urge you to build up some will. I mean, think about, what if your own family, your own children have to live under day-to-day life-threatening situation? Last night, I for some reason, maybe I was too thinking about the event today. Last night, I dreamed about fleeing, jumping off from the window. And I saw a whole lot of blood of killing people in a car. And it happened to be my own car. What if you are in my situation? would you be willing to take some tangible action? That's what I only wanted to ask for your will to help us make a difference.
Thank you, Mara. We're talking a lot about U.S. policy, which seems big and far away, and this is intensely personal to so many people, to all of our panelists here, and to the millions and millions of people they're representing. I'd like to ask one more question to all, and then we have a question that was submitted by the audience. And sadly, I think that's all we'll have time for today. So the question I'd like to pose to anyone who would like to answer is about some progress towards accountability, because we have seen some movements, measured as they may be, to promote justice for the Rohingya genocide, and yet justice remains out of reach for so many people in Burma. What do you think is necessary to advance justice for mass atrocities for your communities, and how can the U.S. Best support those efforts? To anyone who would like to add.
Do you want to go first?
I can start with 2 points, and we can all complement each other's point. The first one, I think it is very important for the US government to provide more support to local organizations who document atrocities and human rights abuses. For example, the US government has provided fundings to IIMM, which is the UN investigative mechanism, but it's the local groups who are doing, I don't know what's the right word to use, who are doing the documentation part, who are dealing with the communities, who are dealing with the victims, survivors on a daily basis. The support that we provide, we receive, if only we can get more, we can be more effective, we can cover more grounds, we would be more effective in our work. So I think providing equal support to local organizations would go a long way in ensuring that we can hold these perpetrators accountable for their actions in the future. And secondly, it would, for the long term, I think it would be very helpful if the US government can help us out with setting up a tribunal. I mean, they've done that in many other contexts in the past. They've played an important role in establishing those sorts of tribunals. So I think preparing from now to help us out, thinking about those would be very helpful, because we have all the data, we have all these atrocities going on, but they've never been held accountable. In the case of the Rohingya, we have a case going on at the ICJ, but these cases can take a long time, So for crimes against humanity and war crimes, I think it's also a good time for the US government to start thinking about it. And I forgot to mention in my previous answer, so please allow me to add on one more thing. We have, as I've mentioned, Chin State is under the Northwest Command structure within the military system. And Sagaing, for example, has also been severely attacked. More than 50,000 houses have been burnt down since the coup. These three regions are also among some of the, the areas that have been hit the hardest. And we've documented entities and individuals within the lower command, but within this Northwestern command chain that we would want the US government to sanction. And we have a report. If anyone is interested, we would be happy to provide you, and so that you can help elevate those voices, because for now, the US government, as you've mentioned, has sanctioned a lot of individuals and entities, but those are at the top level. But sometimes it's also needed at the lower level in the chain, because, for example, the communities in these areas, they have not seen all these regional commanders being held accountable. So, to heal them or to help them get a sense of justice in the process, even during the revolution time, I think sanctioning these individuals can go a long way symbolically. Of course, it may not mean a lot in terms of real-time support, but it can provide a sense of justice to them. And it can also deter civilian enablers. We have seen a lot of Chin leaders enabling the military by providing them with information and all. So if we put them in the sanction list, they will be put on alert that will deter further, support to the military as well. So I hope I don't take too much time, but thank you.
It's okay. Wait.
Sure. Before answering your questions, I actually like to follow Myra on her dream last night, and I actually had a strange dream as well. The Burmese security forces following me to arrest. They actually got me, and it happened to be one of the guard the guard leading in the team happened to be the one that I know while I was in the prison, and she was like assuring that don't worry, I'll make sure you don't get a severe charges. So that was a nightmare. I wake up realizing that was a dream, and I was terrified. And for a lot of us, those who are living in free world today, outside of Burma, it's become a nightmare. But for many millions of people in Burma, it's the reality every day. We cannot forget that it's the reality every day. It is essential that we do everything we can to erase this reality. At least if they become a nightmare, that would be even better than being a reality every day. So I just want to comment that to remind ourselves and how important is the support and the work that everyone and each and every one of you doing. When we talk about justice and accountability, where we can, how do we approach and what can be done more? I think I see it approaching Burma's justice and accountability into parallel way. One, international, providing international path, and two, domestic path. And right now there has been some progress, as we know, through the international path. We have a case before the ICJ. We have investigations in the ICC, and we have few universal jurisdictions cases ongoing. There are many ways that the US government can provide support to these cases, including diplomatic support, political support, and financial support for the case proceeding, fact-finding, witness protections, and etc. And these is each individual cases are extremely important for a comprehensive justice processes, and therefore if the US government can take a bit more a leadership role in terms of looking into the cases and see where they can practically and effectively get involved. I know that there has been some witness protection support available, or work has been done, and some support for the UJ cases. But I think if they can look into all the cases and more in a more holistic way, and that would be great. And also, I think one of the things that we have discussed in the past, we are not discussing much these days, is around providing evidences. US government also has done a lot of their own investigations, and if they could collaborate with the court cases and provide them necessary assistance for these with this data and research, that will be I think very valuable to the team. And otherwise, I think these cases are quite in a way connected, but also quite silo when it's come to the limitations and jurisdictions, etc. So it is a must that there is a court that can actually prosecute the entirety of the crimes, such as it can be done through, as I mentioned earlier today and yesterday, through a referral of the situations of Myanmar to International Criminal Court, or creating an ad hoc tribunal that was suggested by Rosalind and many others as well. Given the limitations as well as challenges that may face creating a new tribunal. Therefore, I mean, there has been a lot more appetite or support for the further support or referral to the ICC's investigations, because there is already one investigation. So that is, I think, to think about the international path to justice. And we all know that these international justice processes can only be held accountable for top leaders of these crimes. You know, it can be like just a few members of the perpetrators who are responsible for the policies and the right authorities. So, but then there is a huge part of the justice that needs to be done through the domestic processes. And I think this is a time for us to start think about domestic justice processes through a transitional justice process. And there is already discussions ongoing within the NUCC, NUG, and others inside. And I think if the US can also provide support for developing a more comprehensive and inclusive transitional justice processes to really deal with the lower ranking officials, crimes involved, people involved in the in these different crimes that military has committed, and also, you know, ultimately think about truth-seeking memorializations or restitutions or reparations of the victims' community, different victims' communities as a whole is a must for us as we build the country again.
Thank you, Wei Wei. And I think they've given us a lot to think of and a lot to take forward. Sadly, I don't have more time to get to the questions, including a few that have been submitted by registrants, but you've actually touched on a lot of the themes that people have submitted. So I'm glad that this has been such a rich conversation, and I'm so thankful that you've been able to join us. If anyone here is interested in learning more about the history of Burma or about the ongoing mass atrocities, we have a table outside the theater where you can buy several books focused on the situation in Burma. They're all available in the bookstore as well. One particular book, A Chance to Breathe, is composed of photographs and poems by Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and proceeds from the sale of the book go directly to the authors and photographers. We would also encourage you to visit our exhibition, Burma's Path to Genocide, which was mentioned earlier in the conversation. It's available on the second floor of the museum. Burmese authorities have tried to erase the Rohingya people from the country and create divisions among many different ethnic groups. We wanted to work with Rohingya colleagues and others to create this exhibition to fight against the erasure and make sure that people could learn about the path to genocide in Burma. So please visit and learn about the experience of survivors from one village called Mongnu, who tell the story of their community before, during, and after the genocide. So thank you again to all of our speakers today, to all of their colleagues, their staff, and supporters who are essential to making all of their work possible. Thank you all for joining us.